Hello and welcome to this session covering the new developer experience released with Sitecore 10. My name is Earlam and I'm a technical evangelist with Sitecore, and in this video we're going to focus on your local developer architecture and your development flow. So let's take a look at your developer architecture first. Now when moving from V9 to V10, you're going to see some key changes in how you'll be doing development, including some new architecture elements you'll have to work with. The first is the introduction of Docker. It is a new approach compared to the previous versions, and you'll see some key advantages, such as much faster startup and teardown times for your architecture, and also the ability to run many more containers on the same hardware compared to using virtual machines. Next up is the new ASPNET Core Rendering SDK. This brings the headless development and delivery model previously introduced through JSS to the .NET world. You can now build a lightweight rendering engine in .NET Core that is cross-platform and able to deliver your content headlessly. Finally, we're also introducing an industry standard tool in the Docker world called Traffic. This is a reverse proxy that is used to manage how you access your different architecture elements. It provides friendly URLs for each of your instances, handles SSL termination, and is really simple to configure. So where do these new architecture elements fit into a developer XM architecture? Well, first of all, let's take a look at how this would work for a standard SXA or MVC site. So you still have your same application elements that you're used to from V9. Your content management, content delivery, identity server, Redis, indexes, and your databases. However, you'll notice that they're each configured to run inside of a Docker container now. Each of the boxes above represent a single container. So for example, your content management instance will have its own container, SQL Server will also have its own container, serving all of your databases, and Solr as well, again in its own container, serving all of your indexes. After this, we also introduce Traffic, the reverse proxy that sits in front of your instances. As you can see, you will as a developer use your browser to interact with Traffic, which will in turn interact with your different Sitecore instances as required. So how does this change when we incorporate the new ASP.NET rendering host? Well, you still have the same containers we saw in the previous diagram, though you will see that the content delivery container moves back, as it's not going to be used to serve our layout anymore. It's purely there to provide content to the rendering host. Then we introduce the .NET Core headless rendering engine, and you'll see that it pulls its data from the content delivery instance, which would historically have been used to serve both your content and layout combined, unless you've been working with JSS, in which case you'll be very used to this model. Again, once more, we introduce Traffic, the reverse proxy that sits in front of your instances. And if we take a look at the XP version of the SXA MVC developer architecture, it looks very similar, just with more containers as would be expected. You can see we have the same containers that were present in the XM SXA MVC architecture. Again, with the content delivery node serving both our content and layout data combined. What we can now see though is our containers for XConnect are also included. Again, all of these sit behind Traffic, so if you have a third-party system pushing data into XConnect, you would see the data come in via Traffic, much in the same way your browsing activities do. And if we take a look at the XP .NET Core version of the developer architecture, again, it's very similar. Just like with the XM architecture, the content delivery element falls back, and the ASP.NET Core rendering host now sits in front of it. Okay, so let's take a look at some of this in action. Okay, so I've got a solution here which is built on top of this Docker-based development approach. So let's go ahead and stand up some containers. I'm going to start off by using the docker compose command. We're going to tell it to bring up my architecture, and we're going to run it in disconnected mode. This architecture is based on the XM diagram that we saw before. So this app's now going to go away and create all of the containers we saw on that diagram previously. Okay, so we can see each of these containers have been created now, but we can also get a bit more detail on them. If we run a docker ps-a, that's going to show me all the active containers on my system. And here we can see a different container for each of the architecture elements we looked at on that XM diagram. We can see I have my Solr instance holding all of my different indexes. I have my Redis instance, which is used to manage session for the content delivery server. I have my SQL Server container, containing all of the databases used to power this architecture. I have my Identity Server container used for authentication. I have my Content Management container, which is where I'll interact with the Sitecore admin interface. I have my Content Delivery container, which in this scenario is just serving content out for my headless delivery approach. I also have my new .NET Core rendering host. This is the lightweight, headless rendering model that we talked about previously. And finally, we also have traffic, the reverse proxy which sits in front of all of these containers, managing access to them. So let's load up a browser and take a look in traffic and see what we have there. Traffic by default runs on port 8079. And this is the interface you get when you stand up a container for traffic. What we're most interested in this scenario is the HTTP information. And here we can see all of the different HTTP routes which are defined. We get some standard out-of-the-box traffic ones at the top, which we're not going to focus on too much today. The ones we're interested in are the four below, which are how we're going to access the 4 different Docker containers we have. You can see we have a route for our content delivery instance. We have a route for our content management instance. We have a route for our identity server. And finally, we have a route for our headless .NET Core rendering host. So if we take the content management server as an instance, so we can copy that URL and access it in the browser. Now this has redirected us over to our identity server instance. Again, notice it's on the HTTP header that was defined in traffic. But we can log in here and you can see we've been redirected back to our content management instance using the URL specified in traffic. And this is the standard CM that you're used to working with in Sitecore. Right, so we've got our developer architecture up and running now. It's probably time we start to take a look at actually pushing some code and content out to it. Let's take a look at this new developer flow. Okay, so when you're developing using an architecture like this, you're going to be using a few different tools. Some will probably be new to some of the developers, and some won't be very familiar. First up, you're going to be using the Docker commands, things like Docker build to create new images and Docker compose to create and destroy your images when you need to. Next up, you're going to be using a few new Sitecore tools, and these are the Sitecore CLI, Sitecore serialization, and Sitecore for Visual Studio. Finally, you'll be using some tools you'll probably be very familiar with, things like MS Build and Visual Studio Deploy. Okay, so let's take a look at some standard development activities you're going to perform in your day-to-day development flow. So, first up, you're going to need to push code updates to your containers. And there are 2 approaches to this. You could do this either using Visual Studio Publish or a Docker build. And I'll go into each of these in more detail shortly, but they're the approaches you'll use to push out your application updates. But you're going to need to push content as well as code. And there are 2 new tools to help you here. The first is the Sitecore CLI, which gives you a command line interface to push your changes into Sitecore, serialize any changes into your project, and also publish any changes you make as well. Sitecore for Visual Studio is a GUI wrapper for this CLI, so you can think of it as being a graphical way to perform the exact same actions. The exciting thing about these tools are that whether you prefer to work on the command line or with a graphical interface, you'll get the exact same level of functionality available from both. So let's talk about those code deployment approaches first. First up is through using Docker build. With this approach, you're going to be taking the Sitecore images, building your own solution, and inserting that code as a new layer. You'll then create a container based on that image. Now, this is useful when you're initially starting up your site, say at the start of your day. It's also going to be used when you want to rebuild the .NET rendering host as well. The rendering host is a .NET Core application, so you can't hot swap the files in and out like you can with a .NET Framework app. The next option you have for the .NET rendering host is to actually run the application from directly within Visual Studio. This means you can get a really fast feedback loop showing your changes as you make them. If we take a look at the Sitecore instances like the content management and content delivery, we've had the entry point scripts which provide PowerShell access to copy your changes into the running container, And these still exist today. This means you can push your changes into there and see them reflected without having to recreate the image in the container itself. Again, giving you a much faster feedback loop than having to create the image all over again. So let's take a look at these in action. Okay, so I've hopped back over to PowerShell and I still have the site running from before. But what I want to show you now are some of the different approaches to how you can integrate this Docker hosted approach into your development flow. The first one I mentioned before is building new versions of images, including your custom code. And you can do that from the CLI in a similar way to how we stood up the architecture before. We're going to use the docker compose command again, but this time instead of up, we're going to say build. What that's going to do now is it's going to go away and it'll check each of the services defined in my docker compose file. It'll check whether they are a service that's created directly from an image, something like traffic where we're not inserting any code customizations, and it'll leave that image alone. What it will do then is it'll build any images that require our customizations. So things like the content management instance, the content delivery instance, and our .NET rendering host. Once that's been changed, we can then just run docker compose up -d again, and that'll bring up any containers which have changed. As I mentioned before, that's not the only way to debug the rendering host itself though. You can actually do that from directly within Visual Studio. Okay, so I've jumped over to Visual Studio here, and you can see my Solution Explorer on the right. The highlighted project here is my .NET Core rendering host, and you can see it's marked in bold because it's marked as the startup project, meaning that's the project that's going to get executed when I perform a build for this solution. So now, to basically build this project and connect my debugger automatically, all I have to do is hit F5. We're fully integrated into Visual Studio now. And then the request's going to come in, and you can see it hits my debugger. A super fast feedback loop from making my changes to standing up the application and getting a response based on the request that's actually come through. As I mentioned, there's another way to perform deployments as well for when you're dealing with the Sitecore elements, like your content delivery and content management instances. We have a few projects like that in here, defining some simple config files and the like. These are all deployed using the watch scripts, which are running inside of those Sitecore containers, and these assets are volumed in. So when I publish this project, it goes to a specified location on the hard disk, which then appears inside the container. And I can actually use the container instances window here in Visual Studio to show you what that looks like. If I go and look at my CD instance, I can go and browse the files. Here, we can see the source volume that's mapped in. This is the output of the publish of this solution. We can see I have some configuration files in here, and I have the DLLs for all the different assets that have been built. The watch script basically monitors this source folder and copies all of these assets directly into the dub root folder here. If we expand the bin directory, here we can see the different DLLs that have been copied in there. What this means is that to do a publish from here into the container, all I need to do is publish these solutions to my volumed folder, and those changes will be instantly copied into the container, ready for me to interact with. But as I said, we're not just working with code here, we've also got to work with content. And this is where the new Sitecore CLI and Sitecore for Visual Studio really come into play. Okay, so I've hopped back over to PowerShell again. Our code's been deployed, our architecture's up and running, but we're going to use the Sitecore CLI now because we need to actually start to push out some content. I've installed it locally here, so I'm going to access it using the .NET keyword. To do that, you type .NET Sitecore, and then you can use the help command to see what's actually available. First of all, we need to authenticate with the instance of Sitecore we're going to be pushing our content out to. So to do that, I'm going to use the Sitecore login command. This will open up a browser and connect me to my identity server instance where I can use my credentials to authenticate. Once you've authenticated, you can see you get this response confirming that you're signed in. And you can go and close the browser now. We return to PowerShell, and you can see we also get confirmation here. And that basically tells us that this PowerShell window now is authenticated against my Sitecore instance, and I can start to issue commands against it. Now, as I said, I've created my containers, I have my code in there. What I really need to do now is to take the content items I have saved as part of this repository and push them into my Sitecore instance. To do this, we're going to use the Sitecore command again. We're going to use the ser command, which is short for serialization, and we're going to issue a push. What this is going to do is it's going to take all those content items which I've previously serialized and push them into my database. We can see that's completed now. So the next thing I want to do is I actually want to publish them as well. And we can even do that from the command line too now. To do that, all we need to do is use a .NET Sitecore publish command. This is then going to take all those content items and move them from the master database over to the web. So that's completed, and in just 2 commands, I've managed to deserialize all of my content items and publish them from master to web. Really easy. But as I mentioned before, there's also a GUI version of this tool called Sitecore for Visual Studio. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio. And on the left here, we get this new Sitecore Module Explorer. This is Sitecore for Visual Studio, and it provides the exact same functionality that I just showed you in the CLI. All those deserialized items which we pushed into Sitecore are stored in these different modules. We can see I have a feature module which contains some templates, layouts, and we can drill down into each individual section. To actually do the push, you can right click and choose to sync the items. We've already completed that previously, so it's going to come back and tell me everything's already in sync. The last thing I really want to show you here is around the debugging experience you get. We looked at the containers window previously, and this time instead, I'm going to go and attach the process for my CD instance. I showed how simple it was to debug the rendering host just by hitting F5. When working with the Sitecore instances like your content delivery and your content management, it's going to be very similar to how you do when working with a host. What we're going to do here is we're going to go and connect to the process executing inside my container. So Visual Studio here has connected to my container and has enumerated all of the processes running in there. I'm going to scroll down and we're going to connect to the W3WP process, which is the IIS process executing inside of the container. I've already set a breakpoint inside my code, so I can go and refresh the application, and here we can see the code's executing and my breakpoint's been hit. So this shows how simple it is for you to get the same rich debugging experience you had working natively on your host, but at the same time running inside these new Docker containers. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to follow the Learn Sitecore hashtag for future videos.